Hope you've finally healed enough to be happy for me. That sentence was handwritten across the bottom of my ex-husband's wedding invitation, in the same slanted blue ink Richard Harper used for grocery lists and birthday cards during our marriage. Seeing it again after 3 years made my stomach tighten so suddenly I had to sit down behind the bookstore counter. Outside rain tapped softly against the front windows of Carter Books on Main Street in Columbus, Ohio. It was almost closing time. A teenager from the coffee shop next door was dragging metal patio chairs inside while traffic crawled through wet downtown streets. I read the note again. Hope you've finally healed enough to be happy for me. I actually laughed once. Not because it was funny, because some people reach 50 years old and still think cruelty sounds sophisticated. Martha Jennings, one of my regular customers, looked up from the mystery section. You all right over there, honey? I folded the invitation quickly. Yeah, just got some strange mail. Well, if its bills don't open 'em after 6 o'clock, ruins digestion. That made me smile for real. After she left, I locked the front door, flipped the open sign to closed, and sat alone with the envelope in my hands. Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Black tie ceremony. The Whitmore estate. Richard was marrying Vanessa Whitmore, daughter of hotel billionaire Charles Whitmore. 3 years ago, that information would have destroyed me. Not because I still loved Richard. That part had died long before the divorce papers were signed. What hurt was how quickly he traded our ordinary life for one he thought looked more impressive. 22 years together. Gone in under 6 months. Sometimes people imagine betrayal arrives with dramatic shouting and slammed doors. Mine came quietly. Richard started buying expensive suits, spending weekends in Chicago, talking constantly about networks and high-value people. Then one Tuesday morning, while I was unpacking children's books for a church donation drive, he looked across the kitchen table and said, I can't spend the rest of my life feeling average. Average. That word stayed with me longer than our marriage did. I closed the invitation and dropped it onto the counter. My sister Diane called about 20 minutes later while I was counting receipts. You got it too, didn't you? Apparently the whole Midwest got invited. Oh, Elaine, don't go. I leaned back in the chair. I haven't decided. Yes, you have. I know your voice. Diane had always been able to hear things other people missed. You know what this is, she continued. He wants an audience. Maybe. He wants to see whether you're still hurting. That part was probably true. Richard cared deeply about appearances. Always had. Near the end of our marriage, he treated life like a performance for strangers. I stared through the bookstore window at rainwater sliding down the glass. You know the sad thing, I said quietly. A small part of me wants him to see I survived. Diane didn't answer immediately. Finally, she sighed. That's human, Elaine. Just don't let him pull you backward. After we hung up, I drove home to my townhouse on the northwest side of Columbus. Nothing fancy. Brick exterior, tiny backyard. One bathroom that constantly made strange noises in winter. But it was mine. That mattered more now than it used to. I microwaved leftover soup, fed my cat Walter, and tried not to think about Richard standing beside some glamorous heiress pretending he'd built his life from scratch. The truth was uglier. When Richard left, he also left debt. Credit card balances, store loans, bills I didn't even know existed because he handled most of our finances. COVID nearly finished me off completely. For a while, I worked mornings at the bookstore and evening shifts stocking greeting cards at a pharmacy gift shop near Riverside Hospital. I remember crying once in my car because I couldn't afford both new tires and dental work in the same month. Nobody from Richard's new world saw those years. They saw polished versions of people at cocktail parties, not women reheating soup alone at midnight. By the time Friday came, I still hadn't RSVP'd. Then Saturday morning changed everything. I was still in sweatpants making coffee when a long black Rolls-Royce pulled slowly in front of my townhouse. At first I thought the driver was lost. People with cars like that didn't come to my neighborhood unless GPS had failed them. Walter jumped into the window as I stepped onto the porch. The back door opened, and suddenly 2 small children tumbled out laughing. Mama? Grace hit my legs first, Oliver right behind her, both wearing matching little navy coats, both grinning like they'd been holding in a secret all morning. I dropped to my knees, instinctively hugging them so tightly Grace squealed. Well, I whispered, trying not to cry, there are my babies. The driver stepped out a second later. Older man, gray gloves, perfect posture. Good morning, Ms. Carter. I stood carefully still holding Oliver's hand. What's going on? Mr. Whitmore sent the car. My chest tightened slightly. Charles Whitmore. Yes, ma'am. I stared at him. The twins had spent the night at Charles's Chicago residence with their nanny, while I handled inventory at the bookstore. That part wasn't unusual anymore. The unusual part was the Rolls-Royce. Why, I asked. The driver gave a small, polite smile. Mr. Whitmore asked me to bring you personally to Lake Geneva. Behind me, Mrs. Delaney from next door opened her curtains so fast I nearly laughed. Grace looked up at me innocently. Mama, are we going to the castle wedding now? And standing there in my old Ohio neighborhood with rainwater still drying on the sidewalks, I suddenly realized something. Richard Harper had absolutely no idea what was about to walk into his wedding. The drive from Columbus to Lake Geneva took a little over 6 hours with 2 toddlers, multiple snack emergencies, and 1 stop outside Indianapolis, because Oliver decided he absolutely could not continue living without apple juice. By the time we crossed into Wisconsin, I was exhausted. The twins somehow were not. Mama Grace asked from the back seat, "Do rich people have microwaves?" The driver's shoulders twitched slightly like he was trying not to laugh. "I assume so," I said. "Then why do they always eat tiny food?" That one made him laugh out loud. His name was Walter, and by the second hour of the drive he'd loosened up enough to tell me he'd worked for the Whitmore family nearly 20 years. Mr. Charles still drives his own pickup sometimes, he told me. Drives security crazy. That surprised me. People in Richard's world loved acting important, but the truly wealthy people I'd met through the Whitmores often seemed strangely relaxed about proving anything. Around 4:30 that afternoon, we pulled through the gates of the Whitmore estate overlooking Lake Geneva. I had seen photographs before. They didn't prepare me for the real thing. The property looked less like a house and more like a private resort. Stone pathways, massive white columns, boats rocking gently near the dock, hotel staff moving quietly across manicured lawns. Grace pressed her nose against the window. "Mama," she whispered, "this place has too many windows." Honestly, she wasn't wrong. Walter parked near the entrance where 2 attendants immediately opened doors for us. The moment I stepped out, conversations nearby noticeably slowed. I understood why. A 48-year-old bookstore owner arriving alone in a Rolls-Royce with twins was apparently interesting enough to interrupt cocktail hour. I almost lost my nerve right there. For one embarrassing second, I wanted to tell Walter to turn around and take me home. Not because I missed Richard. Because I suddenly remembered exactly how it felt to be judged by people with expensive clothes and polished smiles. One of the attendants smiled warmly at the twins. "And who do we have here?" "I'm Grace," she announced proudly. "I'm hungry," Oliver added. Priorities. Inside the estate buzzed with pre-wedding activity. Caterers moved trays across marble floors while guests drifted between bars and sitting rooms, wearing sweaters tied over their shoulders like people in prescription drug commercials. A woman near the staircase glanced at me curiously. Another whispered something to her husband after spotting the rolls outside. I kept my shoulders straight. You learn something after divorce and middle age. Confidence isn't loud anymore. Sometimes it's just surviving uncomfortable rooms without apologizing for existing in them. Then I heard Richard's voice. "Elaine." I turned slowly. And there he was. 3 years older, more expensive looking, tan sport coat, designer watch. Hair carefully styled in that way men do when they're trying very hard not to look like they're trying. But his face changed the second he noticed the twins beside me. Not anger. Confusion. Pure confusion. "Wow," he said carefully. "I wasn't expecting you." "Funny," I replied. I could say the same. His eyes moved immediately toward the front entrance behind me, toward the Rolls-Royce. Then back to the children. "You came with—" Before I could answer, another voice cut across the foyer. "Elaine." Charles Whitmore crossed the room faster than any 70-year-old billionaire had business moving. Tall, silver-haired, navy cardigan instead of a suit, and smiling genuinely. He wrapped both arms around me before I could react. "There she is," he said warmly. "You made it." The entire foyer went silent. I felt Richard physically stiffen beside me. Then Charles bent down toward the twins. "Well, look at these 2 troublemakers." Grace hugged him immediately. Oliver held up a toy dinosaur. "Roar." "A terrifying creature," Charles said gravely. Richard stared at me like he'd forgotten how breathing worked. I understood why. Because none of this made sense from the outside. 3 years ago, Richard left me because he thought I belonged to a smaller life. Smaller dreams, smaller people. And now his future father-in-law was greeting me like family. That was not part of the plan. A tall blonde woman appeared near the staircase seconds later. Vanessa Whitmore. Beautiful in the polished magazine cover way wealthy families somehow produce naturally. Cream sweater, diamond bracelet, perfect posture. But the moment she saw Charles hugging me, something flickered across her face. Not jealousy exactly. Alarm. Dad, she said carefully. Charles turned happily. Vanessa, you remember Elaine Carter. Vanessa smiled politely, though I could see calculation happening behind her eyes. Of course, Richard mentioned you. I doubted that very much. Charles placed a hand gently on Grace's shoulder. Elaine practically built the reading outreach program Margaret started years ago. Vanessa blinked. You worked with Mom's Literacy Foundation. For a while I answered quietly. That part of my life felt very far away now. Back before the divorce, before the bookstore nearly collapsed, before exhaustion became part of my personality. Margaret Whitmore. Charles's late wife had visited Columbus years ago during a literacy fundraiser. We stayed connected afterward. I helped organize children's reading events across Ohio churches and community centers. At the time, I honestly didn't understand how wealthy the Whitmores truly were. Margaret never acted like it mattered. Richard used to mock those volunteer weekends. You spend 12 hours giving away free books to people who won't read them, he once complained. Meanwhile, he spent $14,000 joining a golf club he barely visited. Funny how life works. Vanessa crouched politely beside the twins. And who are these sweethearts? I'm Grace, Grace said again. Oliver pointed at a waiter carrying shrimp cocktails. He dropped one earlier. The waiter nearly choked. Even Charles laughed loudly at that. Richard didn't. He kept studying me carefully now, like a man slowly realizing he misunderstood an entire story. Later that evening, after dinner arrangements were settled, I stepped outside onto the terrace overlooking the lake. The air smelled like water and pine trees. Boats drifted quietly in the distance while string lights reflected across the shoreline. I finally exhaled properly for the first time all day. You look different. Richard's voice again. I turned. He stood holding a bourbon glass jacket removed now. Older, I asked. Calmer. I shrugged lightly. Life does that. His eyes moved toward the ballroom where Charles played with the twins near the piano. Then he looked back at me. Why does Vanessa's father know your children's names? For a second, I honestly considered lying. Not because I owed Richard anything. That part of my life was over. But because once certain truths leave your mouth, you can't put them back where they came from. The lake wind moved softly across the terrace. Somewhere behind us, glasses clinked inside the ballroom while an old Frank Sinatra song drifted through open doors. Richard waited. Why does Vanessa's father know your children's names? I folded my arms against the cold. Because they're his great-nephews. His forehead tightened immediately. I'm sorry. What? I looked past him toward the water. After our divorce, I met someone. Richard stared at me without blinking, and I realized something strange in that moment. For 3 years, he'd probably imagined me frozen exactly where he left me, still sad, still rebuilding, still explaining the divorce to sympathetic people at grocery stores and church potlucks. Meanwhile, entire chapters of my life had happened without him. Who, he asked quietly. Daniel Whitmore. His face lost color almost instantly. Not dramatically, just enough to notice if you knew him well the way I once did. Daniel Whitmore, he repeated slowly. Vanessa's cousin. I nodded. Now, technically, Daniel was more than that. He was Charles Whitmore's nephew through marriage, and had managed part of the family's charity division in Chicago before he passed away. But family trees get complicated around wealthy people. Everybody's somebody's cousin after enough money enters the conversation. Richard let out one short laugh. You're serious? Yes. How the hell did that happen? That question actually made me smile a little, because the answer was painfully ordinary. 2 years ago, I attended a literacy fundraiser in Chicago after Margaret Whitmore's foundation asked me to consult on a children's reading program. I almost didn't go because I couldn't afford a decent hotel room, and my transmission was making grinding noises. Daniel sat beside me during lunch. That was it. No dramatic movie moment, no instant chemistry. He noticed I skipped dessert and quietly ordered an extra slice of pie because he assumed I was too nervous to eat in front of strangers. That tiny act told me more about his character than expensive gifts ever could. He was kind in ways Richard stopped being years before our marriage ended. Not flashy kind. Careful kind. The kind of man who remembered your coffee order and called to make sure you got home safely during snowstorms. Richard leaned heavily against the terrace railing now. You had children with him. Yes. When exactly was this? There it was. The suspicion. The math. I met his eyes directly, long after our divorce. He looked embarrassed immediately. Good. Daniel and I only had 14 months together before the boating accident on Lake Michigan took him away. Some days it still didn't feel real. One minute he was teasing me for overpacking snacks during road trips. The next I was standing in a Chicago hospital hallway trying to understand words like impact trauma and weather conditions. I found out I was pregnant 6 weeks after the funeral. Twins. At 45 years old. I almost fainted inside my OB/GYN's office. Richard rubbed his jaw slowly. So, Charles... He glanced toward the ballroom again. Charles treats them like family because they are family. Yes. Silence settled between us. Then surprisingly he said something honest. You look happy when you talk about him. That caught me off guard. I swallowed carefully. He was a good man. Richard nodded once, staring out at the lake. And for one brief second I saw regret move across his face like a shadow. Not regret for leaving. Regret for underestimating me. There's a difference. Inside the ballroom, laughter suddenly erupted near the dessert table. We both turned. Grace had apparently informed a group of wealthy guests that one woman's face looked too tight for smiling. I closed my eyes briefly. Oh dear God. Richard laughed despite himself. That one's yours for sure. Unfortunately. When we walked back inside, I noticed Vanessa watching us from across the room. Not angry. Studying. People sense history even when they don't know details. And Vanessa was beginning to realize she'd walked into a room where she understood less than she thought. Later that night, after the twins finally fell asleep in the guest suite upstairs, Charles asked me to join him in the library. The room smelled like leather chairs and cedar wood. Old family photographs covered the walls beside shelves full of first editions worth more than my townhouse. Charles poured himself coffee and motioned for me to sit. You all right? He asked gently. I think so. You don't have to stay for the ceremony tomorrow. I know. He studied me quietly for a moment. You know, he said Margaret always worried kindness made people vulnerable. I smiled faintly. Was she wrong? No. He stirred cream into his coffee. But it does make selfish people underestimate you. That sounded painfully accurate. Charles grew quieter after that. Finally, he said, There's something you should know. The tone in his voice changed the room immediately. What is it? He leaned back slowly. I never trusted Richard Harper. I blinked. That makes two of us. I'm serious. Charles lowered his voice. Several people in Chicago have raised concerns recently about his investment firm. A cold feeling crept into my stomach. What kind of concerns? Missing funds, irregular reporting, nothing public yet. I stared at him carefully. You think he's involved? I think ambitious men sometimes mistake confidence for intelligence. Charles paused. And desperate men make dangerous decisions. Suddenly, several strange moments from the weekend clicked together in my head. Richard checking his phone constantly, leaving conversations halfway through, drinking more than usual. Even Vanessa's nervous energy started making sense. Does she know I asked? Not fully. Charles looked older suddenly, tired in a way money couldn't fix. I hoped I was wrong. Before I could respond, voices echoed sharply from the foyer outside the library. Not loud exactly. Controlled. Professional. Charles stood slowly and walked toward the door. I followed him into the hallway. 3 men in dark suits stood near the front entrance, speaking quietly with resort management. One of them held up a badge. And even from halfway across the marble floor, I recognized the letters immediately. FBI. One of the agents glanced down at a sheet of paper before asking calmly, Can you tell us where we might find Richard Harper? I barely slept that night. Not because of the FBI agents. Because of the silence afterward. Rich people know how to hide panic better than most. The agents had spoken quietly with hotel management and disappeared into a private office downstairs. No handcuffs, no dramatic scene. Still, the entire atmosphere inside the estate shifted after that. Conversations became softer. Smiles looked strained, and Richard vanished for almost an hour. I sat awake beside the window in the guest suite, watching lights reflect across Lake Geneva, while Grace and Oliver slept in the next room. Around 2 a.m, I caught myself wondering if I should leave before the ceremony. Maybe that would have been kinder. Cleaner. I never came to destroy Richard's life. Truthfully, I only wanted him to see I wasn't broken anymore. But somewhere downstairs, consequences had already started moving without me. The next morning arrived gray and humid. Wisconsin weather in late September always reminded me of damp sweaters and football weekends. By 7:30, the estate buzzed again with makeup artists, florists, photographers, and exhausted wedding staff, pretending everything was perfectly normal. I took the twins downstairs for breakfast, hoping anonymity might still exist. It did not. The moment I entered the dining room, conversations paused briefly. Not rude exactly. Curious. People had clearly spent the entire night discussing me. The bookstore owner. The twins. Charles Whitmore. The FBI? Honestly, if I'd seen this story happen to someone else, I probably would have talked about it too. Grace climbed into her chair beside the window while Oliver immediately reached for bacon. Mama Grace whispered loudly, "Why are people staring again?" "Because humans are nosy," I answered. A man at the next table snorted coffee through his nose, laughing. Across the room, I spotted Vanessa sitting alone with untouched fruit and black coffee. No makeup yet, no bridal glow, just a tired woman staring at her phone like she hoped different news might appear. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then Richard walked in, and dear Lord, the man looked terrible. Wrinkled tuxedo shirt, bloodshot eyes, jaw tight enough to crack teeth. He spotted me instantly. "You," he said quietly. I set down my coffee cup slowly. "Good morning to you too. We need to talk. I think you've already done enough talking this weekend." His voice dropped lower. "Did you know about those agents? Number. Don't lie to me." That finally irritated me. "Richard, your entire problem is that you still think everything happening in the world revolves around you." He stared hard at me. Then, unexpectedly, his expression cracked slightly. Not anger this time. Fear. Real fear. "I didn't do anything illegal," he muttered. That sentence told me more than anything else could have. People who are innocent usually don't announce it before breakfast. Before I could answer, Charles entered the dining room. Instant shift. Staff straightened. Guests looked away awkwardly. Even Richard stepped back slightly. Charles glanced between us calmly. "Ceremony starts at 11, he said evenly. "I suggest everyone conducts themselves with dignity until then." Richard opened his mouth like he wanted to argue, then thought better of it. By 10:30, guests filled the small lakeside chapel near the estate gardens. White flowers lined the aisle. A string quartet played softly near stained glass windows overlooking the water. The entire thing looked expensive enough to have its own tax bracket. I sat near the back beside Diane, who had driven up from Ohio early that morning after my panicked midnight phone call. She squeezed my hand once. "You okay?" "Honestly," I whispered, "no idea." Grace and Oliver sat between us, sharing crackers from Diane's purse, despite repeated instructions not to. Near the altar, Richard stood stiffly beside his groomsmen. Vanessa hadn't entered yet, and Charles stood alone near the front pew, looking grayer than he had yesterday. The music changed suddenly. Everyone turned. Vanessa appeared at the chapel entrance in a long ivory gown, holding a bouquet of white roses. Beautiful, poised, careful, but not happy. I recognized that look immediately. It's the expression women wear when their instincts are screaming while their pride begs them to keep walking. Halfway down the aisle, she glanced toward her father. Charles didn't smile. That was the moment she knew something was truly wrong. The officiant began speaking once everyone settled. Family? Commitment. Trust. Funny choice of words considering the circumstances. Richard kept adjusting his cufflinks nervously while sweat gathered near his temples despite the cool air inside the chapel. Then just before the vows began, Charles stood up. The room froze instantly. "Before this ceremony continues," he said calmly, "there are matters requiring clarification." Vanessa lowered her bouquet slowly. Richard went completely pale. "Charles," he hissed quietly, "not now. I'm afraid now is exactly the time." The officiant stepped backward like a man suddenly realizing he wasn't paid enough for this wedding. Charles turned toward the guests. "Last night I was informed federal investigators are examining financial misconduct connected to Harper Strategic Investments." Murmurs exploded across the chapel immediately. Vanessa stared at Richard. "What is he talking about?" Richard forced a laugh that sounded painful. "This is a misunderstanding." Charles continued steadily. "Several investors may have lost substantial funds." "That's not proven," Richard snapped. Vanessa's face changed completely now. "You told me the firm was thriving." "It is thriving." "Richard," she whispered, "is it true?" He looked around desperately, then pointed directly at me. "This is because of her." I actually blinked. "Excuse me." "You planned this whole thing," he said loudly now, showing up with the kids, turning Charles against me. Richard I interrupted calmly, "I didn't even know there was an investigation until last night." "That's a lie." At that point, several guests started openly shaking their heads. One older man near the front muttered, "Son, stop digging." Another woman added, "Elaine's carried herself better than anybody here." Richard ignored them. But panic makes people sloppy. And suddenly the polished, successful man he spent years pretending to be disappeared completely. What stood there instead was a frightened, middle-aged man blaming everyone except himself. Then came the moment nobody will ever let him forget. Oliver tugged my sleeve loudly and asked, "Mama, why's that man sweating like a raccoon in church?" The chapel erupted. Not cruel laughter exactly, but the kind people lose control of unexpectedly. Even Diane bent forward wheezing. Richard looked like he might collapse. Vanessa slowly removed her engagement ring. No speech. No dramatic scene. She simply placed it in his hand and stepped away. And standing there in front of wealthy strangers, former co-workers, and his future in-laws, Richard Harper finally looked exactly like what he'd spent years trying not to be. Small. 6 weeks after the wedding disaster in Lake Geneva, autumn finally settled into Columbus. The air turned sharp in the mornings. Maple leaves gathered along the sidewalks outside the bookstore, and every customer who walked through my door seemed to smell faintly like cinnamon or cold air. Normal life returned quietly. That surprised me the most. For a while after the wedding, I expected some dramatic aftermath. Reporters outside the bookstore, endless gossip, public scandal following me around town. Instead, life moved the way it usually does for most people over 50. School drop-offs, bills, laundry, back pain that appears for mysterious reasons. The world keeps going even after moments that feel enormous. Richard's situation, however, did not improve. Within days of the wedding news spread through Chicago financial circles that Harper's Strategic Investments was under federal investigation for misleading investors and moving money through unauthorized accounts. Not millions hidden offshore like some movie plot. Just enough dishonesty mixed with enough arrogance to ruin a career. Apparently, Richard spent years exaggerating returns and covering losses to maintain the image of success. Several clients filed lawsuits almost immediately. The firm suspended him before the investigation even finished. Funny thing about status-driven people, the same crowd that applauds them during success disappears astonishingly fast once embarrassment arrives. I heard bits and pieces through mutual acquaintances. Richard moved out of the luxury condo in Chicago. Several friends stopped returning his calls. One country club quietly revoked his membership. That last part shouldn't have amused me as much as it did. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, a handwritten envelope arrived at the bookstore addressed to me. The return label read, "Vanessa Whitmore." I almost threw it away unopened. Instead, I waited until closing time, made coffee, and sat behind the counter reading it slowly. "Elaine, you did not deserve the way Richard spoke about you. I believed things about your marriage that I now understand were unfair and incomplete. I also owe you gratitude. If that wedding had gone forward, I would have tied my life to someone incapable of honesty. Your children are lovely. Grace still scares me slightly. Vanessa." I laughed so suddenly Walter the cat jumped off the register counter. "Grace still scares me slightly. Honestly, fair enough." I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into my desk drawer. Not as a trophy. As proof that people sometimes grow after humiliation, too. That Saturday, the bookstore hosted its monthly children's reading afternoon sponsored by the Whitmore Literacy Foundation. We'd started the program quietly earlier that year, but after the wedding chaos, donations unexpectedly increased. Turns out wealthy people love redemption stories almost as much as church ladies do. By noon, the shop overflowed with parents, toddlers, strollers, and scattered goldfish crackers crushed into my hardwood floors. Grace sat cross-legged beside the reading rug, correcting everybody's pronunciation like a tiny school principal. Oliver wore a dinosaur sweater and attempted to trade cookies for extra stickers. And for the first time in years, my life felt peaceful instead of temporary. That mattered more than revenge ever could. Around 2 o'clock, Charles Whitmore walked into the bookstore wearing jeans, a brown jacket, and a Columbus Buckeyes cap low over his forehead like he was attempting to disguise being a billionaire. Nobody was fooled. Mama Grace shouted. Grandpa Charles brought donuts. Several customers nearly dropped their coffee hearing that sentence. Charles handed me a bakery box. "Peace offering," he said quietly. "Oliver accused me of buying healthy muffins last week. He was right. Brutal family." We stood near the front window watching the children for a moment. "You've built something good here," Charles said finally. I looked around the bookstore. The uneven shelves Richard used to complain about. The old reading chairs rescued from a library auction. The coffee machine that hissed too loudly every morning. None of it looked impressive by Whitmore standards. But every inch of it felt earned. "I almost lost this place," I admitted softly. Charles nodded. "Most meaningful things nearly break us before they belong to us." That sentence stayed with me. Later that evening, after everyone left, I locked the bookstore and stepped outside with the twins. The streetlights had just come on across downtown Columbus, glowing against piles of orange leaves drifting along the sidewalks. Grace held my left hand. Oliver held my right. For years after the divorce, I thought survival itself was the victory. Then for a while I thought seeing Richard humiliated would heal something inside me. But standing there between my children outside the little bookstore my ex-husband once mocked, I finally understood neither of those things was entirely true. Healing came quietly. In grocery stores where I learned to shop for one. In exhausting nights building a business nobody believed in. In learning that being abandoned doesn't mean being worthless. Richard spent years chasing wealth because he confused attention with value. A lot of people do. They build entire lives around appearances, hoping admiration will silence whatever emptiness follows them home at night. But real wealth feels different. Sometimes it's just peace at the end of a hard day. Sometimes it's children laughing in the back seat. Sometimes it's surviving long enough to become someone stronger than the person heartbreak tried to destroy. And if anyone listening to my story is rebuilding after betrayal, disappointment, or loss, I hope you remember this. The people who walk away from you do not get to decide your worth. Life has a strange way of rebuilding us in places we never expected. Grace tugged my sleeve gently. Mama, yes. Can we get pizza now? I smiled. Absolutely.